colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very, very cordial welcome to the webinar. Of course, I am very delighted for the opportunity to be speaking with you. And I hope certainly we'll find the session beneficial. Of course, as Matthew said, there will be the opportunity for questions. And of course, I am looking forward to being challenged by some of the assertions that I may in fact raise here today. And thanks to Maura for extending the invitation to me. Indeed, I find it a challenge. Of course, Matthew, thank you for the technical bit. So, well, let me first of all give you an idea of what the lecture is about. In a 2012 survey by the Washington-based Pew Research Center, they established that 84%, that is 5.8 billion of the world's population, claimed affiliation to one of the religious cultures, we may say, or one of the religious subcultures of the world. The implication of this is that religious theories and religious cultures are pervasive. It strikes us then as being somewhat ironic that religions, not talk about religions, but religious talk that grapple with religious theories, in my view, have been pushed or are being pushed to the periphery of public discourse. I will show why this is happening, but I am making the assertion that it is reasonable, in fact, it is intellectual honesty to reckon with, to see and to reckon with the contribution of religions and religious theories to human living. Not least, in my view, its contribution to, or potential contribution even to economic success. So, this is, in a sense, what I want to focus our attention on, and just by way of giving you an idea of the outline of the presentation. First, I will explain how this topic came about, and then in section 1, I will talk about the reasonableness of taking religions seriously. In section 2, I will talk about what I call cultural theories of human living. And here I will introduce the major religious and economic theories. And then in the final section, I will talk about spiritual capital. And here I will be introducing what I regard as the distinctive contribution that religions make to economic success, or can make to economic success, and to that extent, to the extent, of course, in which it is present in any society. So let me give, first of all, then, if you like, a background to the topic. A few years ago, I was a regular columnist with one of the leading newspapers in Jamaica, and for a period of about 36 months, I wrote a monthly article that appeared in the Sunday edition of the paper. The articles were by and large a theological contribution to public discourse and debate. One of the articles that got a fair deal of comment and feedback was one I wrote about the role of religions in growing economies. I was writing from Ireland at the time, so it was also a reflection on Irish society. It was the editor who gave the article the title "Economic Success and Religious Affiliation." So in a sense, I cannot be credited for that. But it was with a fair amount of traction that the article appeared in the public space and acquired a bit of feedback. This afternoon I could have spoken on other topics, but the editor of the webinars, Her Majesty Maura, she, in a sense, would have had greatest interest in this topic, and so there's a direct line from 2006 to now to focus on this matter of religion and economic success. Now, despite the fact that many affluent societies have relatively high percentages of religious affiliation, one cannot in any way claim a direct cause and effect correlationship between religious affiliation and affluence. In a sense, I was alluding to the possibility then in 2006 that somehow religions might in fact be playing a role in economic success. It was not claiming any direct causation. In fact, some will argue that the converse is true. That is to say that poorer countries, the poorest countries of the world, in fact, are some of the ones that have the highest religious affiliation. So whereas, for example, in the United States, we have 78% claiming religious affiliation. In the UK, 70+% claim religious affiliation. In Luxembourg, 70%. In Finland, 80+. They're among the more affluent countries in the world. In countries like, say, Haiti, Ethiopia, Niger, which are among the poorest countries in the world, they also have high religious affiliation. So lest anyone, however, might rush to a conclusion here, it is to be noted that two countries that are not known for their affluence, say, for example, North Korea and the Czech Republic, they have the highest percentage of persons who claim no religious affiliation, 71% in North Korea and 76% in the Czech Republic. So what is the point I'm making? I am saying that in affluent society, religions are present. And could it be because of the uncertainty about religious claim, whether it is not reasonable to question if religions have a role in economic success? So in a sense, that is the background from which I come. But I'm going to see whether I can build this up a little bit more so that you can see where I'm going with the topic. So I come then to section 1, and here I'm going to talk about taking religions seriously. And what is the point that I want to make here? In this section, what I will do, I will consider the point that in taking religions seriously, it means reckoning with what in fact might be their contributions to modern society. In the aforementioned survey by the Pew Research Center, where it says, it organizes the 6.9 billion people in the world crassly into two cultural blocks. One they call the religious, and the other they call the non-religious. The theoretical assumption governing this organization of the human community is that one either claims to have religious affiliation or one does not. So you can indeed take objection to the theoretical assumption, but if you grant it, you will construe us as belonging to these two religious blocks, these two great blocks in the world. We're either religious and make religious claims, or we are not religious, we do not make religious claim or claim to affiliation. And I say these are cultures because there are certain worldviews that pertain in these categorizations. In one worldview, the religious, allowance is made for religious influence in the way in which we view the world, in the way in which we participate, in the way in which we make decisions, and in the other it is not. And I dare say, therefore, that it is at least possible that among those who regard themselves as being in the religious culture of the world, that this functions in the way in which they understand economic and economics theory, and in terms of how they become involved in generating economic success. It's the 84% religious affiliation that prompted my assertion to, of taking religion seriously. Further subculture categorization show, for example, that Christians with the 31%, Muslims 23%, Hindu 15%. However, this cultural categorization, by this cultural categorization, the third largest block of individuals in the world would be those who claim non-religious affiliation, and that's 16%. So when we look at the major religious blocks in the world, then the question then is, how is it that the non-religious worldview is having greater and greater role in the determination of public discourse? Or to put it the other way, how is it that the religious worldview is having less and less role in the determination of public discourse? There is really no justification, it would seem, for not assigning a role to religious factors, and I say not least in relation to economic success. Religious cultures are not lacking in the power or the capacity to influence public discourse because of their claims. I am contending that part of the reason for their apparent lack of power is because of their diversity. The non-religious bloc, you will see, is fairly united with reference to religious affiliation. In this bloc, there is a single no religious claim. However, in the innumerable subcultures in the religious bloc, there is, the diversity is so extensive that it is probably impossible to get a common view among them. Take, for example, the situation in Christianity. Each center of authority, be they the Oriental Orthodox or the Nestorian churches, the Roman Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox, in terms of how they are divided, the Old Catholic or the Anglican, the Protestants or the Pentecostals or the Charismatic movement, each of which would have their own further subdivision. Each center of authority within this culture can be further subdivided. So what we're having is a situation of extreme diversity. Do not take for granted the extent to which diversity has a negative impact on economy. In fact, there is one research that was recently undertaken, and I'll come back to it a little later, that in fact suggests that diversity, in fact, will impact negatively on economic success. However, it is because of this plurality of religious traditions, in a sense, why I came to reflect a little bit more seriously on how to reckon with the competing claims that come from these religious traditions. And this is what led to the publication that I made in 2009, Protestant Theology of Religious Pluralism. The aspiration of this publication really was to find a theological discourse that would overcome the clash of claims, at least within the Protestant subcultures. The amazing diversity in the Christian tradition is not unlike what we find also in the Islamic tradition. And this, of course, this diversity must sensitize us to how we speak about Islam. Because, for example, as is the situation in, say, Iraq today, we hear allusions being made to Sunni Islam, and we hear reference being made to Shia Islam, as if to say, because they're Sunni, they would be a homogeneous bloc. But appreciating the diversity within each of these is something that is important. Again, this diversity within Islam is what sensitized me in an earlier publication that was called A Formula for Conversation, Christians and Muslims in Dialogue. And in this publication, it was my own effort, so to speak, to find the language to help to guide the relationship between Christian and Islamic cultures. And this, of course, has had some amount of success. But what at least one recognizes is that it is an ongoing challenge to be able to find a way in which the different religious traditions relate to one another. So this brings us to the situation as we might find it in modern society. And this trek that I would have given through the religious cultures, be they Christian or Islamic, is to make the point that modern society can be realistically construed as existing in two major cultural blocks. One is highly diverse, and this I call the religious block. The other is somewhat more homogeneous, and I call that the non-religious block. This irretrievable diversity in modern society makes for what I call uncertainties. It also makes for violence, and it makes for human deprivation. So, if you like, the religious irrationality, as some would regard it, and I wouldn't seriously, argue with them, or the economic rationality, as some would call it, and again, I wouldn't have much quarrel with them. But whether religious or economic, whether irrational or rational, what we see is that there is a darker side to these two theoretical blocks, because we see in relation to religion, we see the allusion to violence, but certainly in relation to economics, we see the reality of poverty in the world. So neither the theories of religious irrationality nor the theories of economic rationality have been able to solve the problem of human deprivation and equality. And speaking about human deprivation, look at the situation with what we call the global wealth pyramid. The extent of inequality and deprivation can be illustrated here. I mean, you can look at it and take any pick you would like. But what I want to emphasize is the fact that 69% of the world's population lives on less than €140 per week, which is in fact less than the Irish government pays for social welfare to people who are unemployed. It is for this reason that I come to consider these themes of human living, what I call the human subcultures. But I will pause a little bit, since we are at the end of section 1, to hear, Matthew, what might in fact be a question that you might raise, or we see take stock as we come to the end of section 1.
Wow, that is a strong start, Livy. And we probably need to encourage a couple more questions. So do feel free to type in either a comment or a question. We've got a ridiculously large one to start with, Livy. So just feel free not to quote the whole of your second book, but just the headlines. Did you make any headway in reconciling Christianity with the Muslim faith?
Headway.
Pause for thought. Here we go.
Headway. What I think the book did was that it contributed to a whole body of literature that of a similar genre that was, in a sense, dedicated to facilitating dialogue between the religious traditions. So in that sense, it made headway because it was another example arising out of a particular Christian religious tradition to show how it is possible to enter into this conversation with Islam. So in that sense, yes, it made headway. But I think it's also important to note that this is not a project that has terminated. Neither is it a task that somehow has an end point, because it's ongoing and the situation is changing.
Very good. But I mean, maybe a key point there, I'm sure it came out. The studies seem to be starting with the commonalities in terms of the Quran, the Torah, the religions of the book, or the Abrahamic. So there is a STEM dialogue in terms of common history, but one imagines there is a reconciled presence as well in terms of values. I mean, what I'm trying to think is can one simply sort of template culture theory onto this? Is there any crossover between how we would reconcile cultural difference with religious difference?
Well, I think it is easier that we understand the religions as we would a cultural community. In fact, there's a theologian by the name of George Lindbeck who wrote a book called The Nature of Doctrine, and essentially the argument that he made was that the way in which we understand religion is precisely as we would a culture. In fact, he used the idea of the language as probably modeling most closely what it is to be in a religious tradition. So you have this, you have the structure of the language, but within the overall structure of the language, you have certain rules that govern how you actually speak, so that you may actually learn to speak the language, but it does not necessarily mean that you are able to speak the language effectively to anybody. So it is in a sense, it is in that sense we should understand the religion, that it is something you have to experience in order to truly know, and you probably can't do it from the outside.
Sounds you're reminding me of a Buddhist scholar who said exactly that. From a different perspective, it's fairly shallow to just describe it. There's something more there. Very good. You'll never guess who is writing with depth and power. Young Dr. Simons. Here's a statement. My perception is that claims of religious membership have little to do with theological or economic discourse that underlies, for example, US economic belief and behavior. I don't know if you have a reaction to that.
Well, I have a reaction to that, and it is that we shall see, because as I press on a little further, one of the things I'm going to talk about is these cultural theories that are economic and cultural theories that are theological, and to see what, in fact, this assumption of no place for religious affiliation in this, whether it really will hold up. So I'll come back to George on that question, but I'm happy to take his challenge.
Okay, so I'll leave it to you. Good.
Shall we press ahead then with section 2?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, in this section, what I want to consider is two sets of theories. I call them cultural theories that address the issue of successful living. The theories are probably well known, and so I will emphasize their main aspiration and claim. I will then comment on the strategies they employ. And the point of this is that I want to emphasize that A, these theories have similar aspirations for human living, and B, that they rely on similar capital in order to accomplish their end goal. So I will speak first of all about cultural theory, the religious theories. 4 of these are mentioned here: the Christian, the Islamic, the Hindu, and the Buddhist. Now, bear in mind their respective diversity, which we have alluded to earlier, but they reflect the aspirations of 76% of the world's population between them. Now, it's in a sense first point at which I may allude to George's concern as to any possible relationship between religious affiliation and economic theory. Well, one should not underestimate the impact that the Buddhist commitment to the Eightfold Path to Nirvana or the Hindu desire to avoid reincarnation at a lower level of being, or the Muslim belief in the way of the Quran, or the Christian belief in the way of Jesus, how these will have, the impact that these will have on how economic theory is construed because of how life is lived in the real world. It is only to the extent that the individuals may not have any serious conviction of their affiliation can be claimed any separation between economic thinking, economic action, and religious affiliation. But what we know from experience, and as I will press on a little further, we'll come on further to see, is that the way we construe the world has a lot to do with our fundamental theories of life. And consequently, it is going to have an impact on our ethics and on our morality. And I'm saying that economic theorization or economic, on the way we understand ethics in the economy, the way in which we construe the use of money and how capital is used, we should not underestimate the weight that fundamental primary level convictions will have on these. So powerful are the claims that these religious subcultures make and are having on the lives of individuals, that some of these religious subcultures go so far as to deny the truth of others. We refer to those as exclusivist cultures. There are others that operate with a much more inclusivist cultural framework, and in these other religious traditions are credited as having some salvific value. The pluralists are those religious cultures or traditions that construe religions as we would culture or as we would a religion, so that they are on par. In a sense, it has to do with how they function, and so they are not inclined to deny the truth of others. So these are the main, we may say, the major economic, the major religious theories, and it is not without significance that together between them they account for 76% of the world's population. But let me talk a little bit about the economic theories. And here, the diversity and the conflicting claims in religious cultures are not unique, because in a similar way, we have the conflicting claims in economic theories. Adam Smith, who lived in the 18th century, Karl Marx, who lived in the 19th century, as well as John Maynard Keynes, and Friedrich Hayek, who lived in the 19th century, and Milton Friedman, who lived in the 20th century, have been called the five apostles of economic theories. The theories that preoccupy the thinking of contemporary economists, rather, whether they are from the neoclassical grouping or the endogenous grouping, or whether they are concerned with what they call the cumulative theory of economics or the new geography. All of them are based on aspects of these five apostles theories. The theories tend to have, they tend to differ primarily in relation to the role of the individual in the market, or the role of government and government policy, and over factors relating to capital, to labor, and to location. So in the neoclassical, the emphasis is on investment and self-interest. The endogenous put a great emphasis on innovation. The cumulative theory, which is significantly influenced by the Keynesian, put a lot of emphasis on government policy and the need for corrective measures so as to ensure that the goods are shared and can be, so to speak, a kind of a management of the market. And then the new economic geography puts a lot of emphasis on what they call increasing returns to sale. That is to say, the idea that the more you put in terms of investment, the more you're likely to get back in terms of returns. But also it is based on the idea that when there is a kind of what they call a agglomeration, that is to say there are different industries existing in proximity with one another, they're likely to have a better possibility of success. So all of these theories, however, they have not strayed far from the views that would have been expressed by these five apostles. Now, and what are the economic strategies that are therefore used to promote growth? Economic strategies relate primarily to investment, to human capital, to innovation, to macro policy, having to do with how the economy is organized, and monetary policy in relation to that, have to do with the institutional framework in a given location, how banks operate and other financial institutions, with trade, relating to socio-cultural issues, which will have to do with the kind of a tradition that exists in a particular place, but it's also related to geography. Hence, for example, we see the kind of impact, the kind of industries that come out of the Nordic countries and the kind of production that come out of the Asian countries. However, as George Petracus and others in a recent article called "The Determinant of Growth," the expert view, in which they interviewed and plotted the views of what they would regard as the leading economic thinkers of the world and persons that are in position of managing the leading corporations of the world. They came to the conclusion that the determinants of economic dynamism do not have the same influence in advanced as well as less advanced economies. What they're saying, in other words, is that what leads to success in one country will not necessarily lead to success in another country. And it is the unlikely success of strategies across the board, which leads me then to raise the question about the possible impact of religion in economic success, and particularly in relation to the matter of spiritual capital, which I'm going to come to now. But let us be clear about the point that I'm making. It is this. The economic theories, as they have been advanced, as they have been discussed, one of the things that is recognized about them is that some theories work in one place and other theories work in another place. There is no guarantee that any economic theory will have the same effect in every nation. And we may say, in fact, that is really intuitive, because it is the failure of the economic theories to work consistently while we are having the situation in the world, as we would have illustrated in the wealth pyramid. It is precisely because, even though the aspirations of these would be that they would somehow bring about well-being in the world, notwithstanding that, what we see is that there is great disparity of wealth, and there is great deprivation in the world. So I am contending that the theories have failed, and consequently there is the importance of raising the question of whether it will not be in order to consider a review of the economic theories. And I am suggesting that considering spiritual capital is an important consideration as a contribution from religious cultures of the world. So I'm going to come then in section 3 to the matter of spiritual capital, but I pause there that you might see whether or not I am losing you, Matthew, and what questions that might arise.
Can I say you've set a new world record for loading us up with mind-blowing concepts? So yeah, it would be easy to get lost. If anyone wants to type in a question to get clarity, that's fantastic. Can I just give you something simple? Do we assume that any of the 5 apostles, funny that you give them a religious club to belong to, as a side question, were any of them practicing in a religion? Do we assume that they prescribe? So there's the descriptive. I know Marx was descriptive rather than prescriptive. Were any of them, are all of them prescriptive of a utopia? Or are all of them real enough to say there's a win-lose, which is reflected in your pyramid? Were they trying to eradicate that pyramid or make it fair or benign? Or do you think really the things that you're talking about, that there's an acceptance in economic theory of poverty, say?
Only in my reading of it, only in the more carefully nuanced theories, for example, like the cumulative theory, which there is a significant allowance that is made for poverty. Although Hayek would have held a view that a certain level of unemployment may be necessary within an economy, so as to allow for a certain amount of public intervention. But by and large, what these theorists were about is how it is to make a society what they regard as the best, economically speaking. And so the idea, I mean, even if you take the fundamental theory of Adam Smith, it is predicated on the view that each individual can, in fact, have a role to make an advancement in the society. And so it was always about what is for the upliftment and the well-being of the society and the individual.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so yeah, I think we're getting there. And then that idea of advancement, internal control versus fatalism. Actually, here we are. Here's something here. A question here from Germany. What about Judaism that has had an impact on various economic strategies throughout the centuries? Is it not visible in various cultural circles?
That is a fair point, because the Judeo-Christian tradition is the largest. If we put them together, is the largest of the religious blocks, and certainly many of the individuals who have leading roles in in international multinational corporations, they are individuals who are closely aligned and regard themselves as faithful, committed to a particular religious tradition, not least within Judaism. But again, in Judaism, there's a fair amount of diversity, and I did not single it out because of the numerical insignificance of Judaism as a religious subculture. But I do take the point that yes, it has played a role traditionally. And it is probably much more reflected now in the Christian tradition, which has harvested its own perspective.
Very good. Just one more comment, maybe before we go on to section 3. Can you make a comment? There's two parts to religion. There would be the wealth of the church and the wealth of the followers. So if we think of Rome or televangelists, there is a different economic factor in terms of contribution or donation and the experience of life. I don't know if you've got a comment on that.
It is true that that the institutional churches that have a very large institutional framework, that they have a lot of resources that are held as and which of course indicative of their wealth. And so it is with a small televangelist operation that the individual head of corporation will of course be operating on a different lifestyle than the others. I mean, one interesting example is that which we hear sometimes in comment, the head of one of the large Pentecostal churches operating in Nigeria, yes, he travels in his jet from place to place because he owns it as head of corporation. The interesting thing is that the members of the church seem to believe that it is okay because he's the head and he must at least model some of the ideas and the aspirations about which the church emphasizes. So I take the point that individuals and organizations that they will have a different wealth profile from all the faithful. But for me, that only indicates the capacity within the world for inequality. It is not just a feature of the of religious traditions, and I'm not either making the claim that somehow religious traditions will help to will be able to solve the the inequity of the world on its own. I am simply, and I will emphasize this a little bit more when I come to section 3, that the spiritual contribution to economic success is something that should be reckoned in with the other things that help to ensure economic success.
Exactly. Okay. Well, should we move on to section 3 and take it from there?
So moving on to section 3 then, let's take stock. We have looked at religions, which I say we must take seriously, not least because of the percentage of the world's population that would in some way associate their understanding of the world and therefore would be in their own ethical and moral decision making, not least in the field of economics, will be operating within that worldview. We have also looked at religious and economic theories, and the conclusion is that I'm making is that there is no justification for excluding religions from having a role in understanding or understanding of or determining of economic success. Economic theories are not sure to succeed in bringing about wealth and success in economies. Some theories fail in some economies, and in the fact that inequality has persisted in the world is in fact indicative of the failure. Religious theories do not simply aspire for economic success. but they might contribute to it is my contention. And in this section then I will make the case for what religions as cultural theories of life might contribute to economic success. So I want to move on then here in section 3 to speak about what I call spiritual capital. Spiritual capital refers to a disposition that arises from an orientation to a particular religious belief. And probably the best definition comes from Roger Fink from Penn State University, when he speaks about religious capital as the degree of mastery of an attachment to a particular religious culture. To fully appreciate religion requires emotional attachment and experiences that become intrinsic to one's biography. Together, these emotional attachments and the mastering of a religion become investments that build up over time and constitute religious capital. So this last point that I think is important, that the emotional attachments and the mastering of the religion become the function like investments that build up over time and in a sense constitute capital. So what it means, for example, is that an individual who has a certain understanding of how money is to be used at a personal level and at the investment level. And that understanding of money is based on the individual's religious attachment to a religious culture. That become investment over time as a capital, and that is part of what helps to, in a sense, drive what may be regarded as spiritual capital. This capital helps to explain religious activity and of course what we regard as the satisfaction of the individual. We refer then to the capital, spiritual capital, or some refer to it as religious capital, as part of the human and social capital which arises from this attachment to a particular religious tradition. In this regard, the capital arises from the attachment, the capital that will arise from attachments, say, that an individual within a Buddhist culture would be different from the capital that arises from someone who is attached to an Islamic culture. They are spiritual capital, I'm contending, but they're not necessarily the same. The cultural character of the spiritual capital, then, in this regard, should not be underestimated. The term spiritual capital is really not a recent invention. In fact, it has been around since Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations. And some will regard The Wealth of Nations, that book by Adam Smith, as the Bible of capitalism. In fact, spiritual capital arose precisely because there was a man in Germany called Adam Mueller who, as part of his critique of Adam's failure to ascribe a greater role to religious culture and theory, raised this issue of spiritual capital. So that by the time we come to Max Weber, who in the 1920s was writing The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, what he was in fact doing was harvesting and making an application of this idea of spiritual capital. In fact, we may say that Max Weber's book on the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is probably the best text that has a wide acceptance across the whole field that links a certain capital from a religious point of view to a certain approach to economy. So spiritual capital then it's not something that has it's not a recent invention, and it is in fact goes back to the time of Adam Smith's raising of writing of the Wealth of Nations. But the thing to emphasize about it is that it refers to the particular disposition that the individual has, the disposition which is predicated on their understanding of self in the particular religious tradition. Well, let's see whether we can then make some application of this spiritual capital. And let me illustrate it with reference to 4 of the religious subcultures and the ideas that weigh significantly in the way in which people in those respective traditions approach economics. The Judeo-Christian proverb, for example, that a false balance is an abomination, underpins the imperative for fairness with respect to standard for goods that in earlier economies. Fairness is important, and this concept of quality assurance that we have in modern economies, and the importance of quality check, and these concepts is consistent with, and in fact predicated on, something which has arisen out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. In fact, I suppose it may be important to say rather that when a Christian takes seriously this idea of fairness as a religious conviction, it will have its application in the way in which they approach their economic life. But more importantly, when the world of business takes seriously this importance of fairness and balance and quality check, then it is in fact an application of an example of an application of a Christian of an ethic which is part of our spiritual capital. Or let's use the example from Islam. In one of the surahs in the Quran, there is a teaching that the wrongful acquisition of property is an abomination. It is not to happen. And those of us who are aware of certainly many of the groups within the Islamic traditions take the word of the text of the Quran as the very word of the divine Allah, and it is not something on which the individual may have therefore and a discretion. It is not without significance that the structure of inequality in the nations in the world is related to the kinds of payments that have been made for property and minerals. And we don't have to go very far to begin to show how the minerals that are mined in some countries, that when a fair payment is not in fact given, that it amounts to a wrongful acquisition of property. The Islamic ideal of not acquiring property wrongfully is an example of what I call an Islamic spiritual capital. Or let us use the Hindu concept of karma. The Hindu concept of karma is based on the law of consequence. And basically what it's saying is that the decisions that you make now is going to have impact on you in the future, and the quality of these decisions will result in a certain quality of experience, whether good or bad. Now, for the Hindu, the thing that is to be avoided, if you like, is reincarnation. And when the karma of the individual is at a low level, then they are going to be caught in this cycle of reincarnation, where they are reincarnated at a lower level. So bad karma is not something that is countenanced within the Hindu tradition. I put it to you that if this idea of good karma or this law of consequence was being observed by those who were doing the speculation within the world financial system, that it would be a hedge against the subsequent deterioration, because what seems evident in any case is that many of the actors speculated without regard for the consequences. Bad karma, or avoiding bad karma, or taking seriously the science of consequence, is an example of what I call the Hindu spiritual capital. Well, let's finally look at say, the Buddhist. At the center of the Buddhist Eightfold Steps to Nirvana stands the concept of perfect livelihood. And what the Buddhists mean by this is that if you are to make your ascent to to what we regarded as the perfect life, that one of the things that stands in the middle through which you must pass is what is regarded as a perfect livelihood. And the way in which Buddhists would explicate this is that they would see the certain kinds of livelihood as being ethically suspect. Consider, for example, the difference it would make if the resources that are used for the trade of arms, which for the Buddhist, this is something that cannot be justified. For the Buddhists, to trade arms, it would be like to trade individuals in slave labor. They do not countenance it. What if the resources that were used for the trading of arms was to be invested in a sustainable economy and individual? So I'm saying that this idea of livelihood is another example of what I call Buddhist spiritual capital. I hope I've made the point, because I have come to the end. Because the point I want to make essentially is that the religious theories and the economic theories, they all aspire for well-being, wealth, and sustainability. But these have happened in an unequal and an inconsistent way. If we follow the economic theories as they are present, no well-being can be guaranteed for the world economy. Some indeed might, and in some places, but what we may say from the structure of the world as we have it, we cannot say that they have been successful. So given the colossal failure at the world level, I am contending that a review of economic theory is as imperative, and that what might in fact be missing to add to some of the strategies that are being used is to give a little bit more weight to what I call spiritual capital, because it has a role in economic success. I make my case, Matthew.
You rest your case. Guys, type in some questions.
You rest your case. Guys, type in some questions.
So, George has put Buddhism and arms, so former Burma, Myanmar, where the two are sort of clashing and crashing together, or either the recent incidents within Thailand itself. So he was saying there's maybe a contradiction between a belief and practice.
Yeah, I think that even in the communities in which a certain position is held, it is even these communities, the ideals, there's also the need to challenge for the ideals. I mean, you take, for example, the attitude that some nations of the world have to the democratic wish of other countries. If it is not in a way that suits them, or the outcome doesn't suit them, they may not even recognize it, although it's a democratic ideal which is favored. I mean, the existence of Guantanamo Bay is another example of what they regarded as due process for individuals have who this is the critique that is made against a country that in fact aspires and makes such heavy weather of due process and fairness. So the ideals. So it is true within the religious cultures. The fact in Ireland, say, recently one of the big things that have been challenging the society is the history of abuse that would have taken place within the Catholic Church itself, that was credited with the duty of looking after children, and it turned out that many children were abused. So the communities are not without the history of falling below the ideal which they themselves aspire for.
Absolutely. Another contrast, someone's made a comment here. There was one study that looked at religious sub-religions within Christianity and found that Protestant GDP was greater than Catholic GDP. Would that be proof of the connection between religion and economic prosperity?
Well, I couldn't make that kind of a claim, because if you're talking about say a country like Finland, it may be true. But then if you're talking about a country like, say, Saudi Arabia, which has a very high GDP per capita, it's Islamic. So I wouldn't draw a straight line between them in that way. I am making the case, do not exclude spiritual capital from how you understand how economic success may be gained. So I would be, I think, a little disingenuous to draw a direct line, because then it would have to be true in all cases.
No, it seems to be, you could look at psychology and the idea, where do we get our beliefs from? We get them from models, so spiritual leaders. How do we unconsciously act? We act on what we believe to be true. So believe in terms of fact, or believe in terms of faith. And therefore, it's not illogical. I think it's fairly easy for people to digest that. So I think theoretically we can get it. It is the religious disasters and the economic disasters which are more difficult to comprehend, either from an economic perspective or a religious perspective.
Oh, that's a fair point. I mean, the only difference, in a way, I may say, is that there has not been any serious articulation, certainly not in the modern economic theory. I would say there is no appreciation, and maybe in some cases not even awareness of the capital that are spiritual capital that may in fact be driving some of the decisions that are good decisions, that are maybe some as a hedge against as a way of promoting the best case in economics, so that when the head of a corporation is making decisions, is it purely based on their understanding of economic, or where is the spiritual capital functioning in the way in which they are actually making those decisions? It is that kind of recognition of the spiritual capital I'm also calling attention to.
Lovely. Yeah, no, absolutely. George has a comment here. U.S. faith is that everybody has the chance to succeed. If not, it's their own fault. So you have the dark side as well. God helps those who helps themselves. So is George aligning the two in America? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the God helps those who help themselves is a very, I think, unfortunate attempt to make an application or to ascribe a cultural attitude to a religious ethic. I mean, there's no place within the Judeo-Christian tradition where that can be justified, whether in text or in theological history. but it is a nice sounding phrase for emphasizing the importance of individual making effort. So effort is important, and it is not only in the Christian tradition where effort is recognized. In fact, in the Buddhist tradition, a cardinal principle is the importance of making effort, and so I think making effort has to be recognized. But we do know that there's also the need for the context in which the effort is being made. There are other things that must pertain to that context as well, because there are many hardworking people throughout the world who do not make it, not because of failure to make effort, just because of the nature of the context.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the moral argument, isn't it, for American self-help or policy, but you've got that idea of effort. That the classic is the Protestant work ethic, and then is it fair to say the other end of the spectrum is fatalism, inshallah?
Yeah, I mean, fatalism is real, and maybe in many ways it is related to the recognition that effort will not necessarily succeed, and there are many examples of people not being who make effort but not having opportunity, and so it doesn't work out. But it certainly does not have religious justification. None of the religions would support that approach at all.
No, exactly. Okay. George Simons again. Cecil Rhodes, Religion, Economics, Colonial Imperative to Spread the Capitalist Faith Amongst Inferior People. Provocative stuff. So the missionary zeal, to spread the Christian word.
Well, the imperialism of the religious traditions, not least Christianity, I would probably should say most of all Christianity, and maybe to a similar extent Islam, they've had imperialist tendencies, and in some places, again, I would say that there have been many examples of the religious traditions failing to demonstrate that they are committed, or individuals within them, that they are committed to the ideals about which they aspire. So they have failed to live up to their own ideals, and imperialism would be another example.
Yeah, it's very good. Yes, the brochure looks good, the practicality less so. Yeah, someone in Italy is losing their faith slightly. I wish God and goodness could really help. It's okay. That may be a private crisis going on there. We might minister to her later. The other end of the spectrum: if everybody helps everybody else, everybody gets helped. Versus is if everybody takes care of number one, everybody gets helped. So one is. That reminds me of a phrase, just before you answer that or react to that. Tony Robbins, what can we do for the poor, not become one of them? So by helping ourselves, we rise above. Rich people help more people is the self-determining.
Yeah, well, I think if you had an equal world and equal opportunities and everyone was starting from the same place, that is a fair point to make. But consider that the existential reality is inequality. Yeah. Inequality of opportunities, and there are also attitudes of power, and there are also attitudes of subjugation, that these are present, and you have to work against them. So we do not have a level playing field in that sense. So there is always the importance then of considering those who are more vulnerable, because of either history or because of their own, there are certain things within their own human condition. And in fact, I dare say that a society, how would you regard a society that says to people who are born with certain defects, physical and otherwise, do your best and get along? There has to be a way in which the society addresses itself to them. So it's just to make the point that the vulnerable in the society, and those those who are, not everyone will have the same ability to access the resources and the opportunities.
No, absolutely. And isn't it, well, is it a religious measure? Is it an economic measure? How we deal with our water or how we deal with our disadvantaged could be seen as a sort of civilization index or an economic prosperity index or a moral index. So I take your point, the starting point or the current point. There are various measures which are viable within an economic measurement or a religious measurement or a sort of civilization index.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I'm challenging, here as listeners, what I'm challenging us to see is that the fact that 84% of the world's population have an idea about the place of religion in human society and choose to associate with it in one way or the other, prompts us to say, well, what is it that this particular worldview, what is it bringing to what we aspire for example, economic success? Is it completely unrelated to it? I contend it is not unrelated to it. No. But in fact, we can mine the traditions to find what I call within them the spiritual capital and make it apply.
So the reconciliation, what do they have to give to each other? What can economists, what can a sixth apostle give to a religious leader?
Well, if you like, we have, if we use you can refer to any saint within the religious, the Christian religious tradition, or a thinker within the Buddhist tradition, or certainly the ideals of these traditions. They have contributed what I may regard as theories by which around which individuals are constructing their lives. And that is a contribution that they have made, and it is within that contribution that the capital exists. The difficulty in the modern society is that because of the strength of the block, a homogeneous block of non-religious, there is a continual pushing of the idea of the spiritual to the periphery. Yeah. Even though, when you think about it, they are in the minority, but as a homogeneous block, it's a very, very powerful block. And many people who are, in an unintended way, they get caught up in this idea, not necessarily because they have reflected on it, but in a sense, it is. They then say the rest of the world, the remaining 84% of the world, that they are simply being silly.
No, absolutely. So, and it's self-reinforcing, isn't it? So, you would probably have a Anglo-Saxon or Northern European view, which might be less religious, and they are owning things like the media, and so there is a disproportionate amplification of message. Isn't it that part of that maybe the false quote in terms of help yourself? It is an exaggeration of that. It's a continuation of that. But also, I mean, so many people can make a lot of money, a crazy amount of money, and find it spiritually hollow, and go on to do something more fulfilling. So is there a pendulum that goes between these things? So the religiously disillusioned or independent can sometimes return that.
Yes, and we have many examples of individuals who, because of their own spiritual worldview commit their resources to causes which surprise people.
Yep.
It would be, for example, when an extremely wealthy woman dies in England, she leaves her wealth for the welfare of her dog or her cat or something like that, because of her own belief in the welfare of animals. In a similar way, there are individuals who, because of their commitment to and their belief in the religious cause with which they are associated, they commit their resources and sometimes their time and their lives for the advancement of those causes.
Absolutely.
I mean, I dare say, if you think of someone, when you think of, let's use a very someone who's in the public eye, like say Clooney in the United States, who's someone who is very concerned about some of the things that are happening in some of the industries in Africa. Now, the basis of that, or the basis on which that care for humanity is predicated, is analogous, I say, to human capital. I mean, to religious capital or to spiritual capital, because its justification has to do with about how the individual feels about ideas about justice and fairness, and I dare say the care of the human being. These things are what do we mean when we speak about spiritual capital?
Yeah. Understood. Livingstone, I think it's been an amazing journey, and there's lots to digest. Would you be open if people were to put their comments to you, to email maybe their thoughts when they've had time to digest some of this, to reflect and put that to you?
Oh, I'd be most happy. I'd be quite prepared to respond to them, depending on the context in which they communicate. I'd be quite happy to respond by email or otherwise.
Wonderful, because I think this is just the start, really. Within the context of the cultural societies in which we operate, I think this is one of the first forays into the religious contribution to that. But I don't think it'll be the last. So I think that's good. So what we're going to do, we will contact you after the webinar anyway, and you'll have the various contacts. So if you want to put a constructive point of view, comment or question to Livy, then that would be hopefully a permissible idea. I think it is time to feed the kids or to put the cat out. Can I say, Livingstone, again, that was the heaviest lorry we've ever ridden across the broadband. Fantastic. Most of us, when we read that title, thought this will be an interesting one. How is he going to reconcile that? I think we have done something amazing and obviously very, very important and impactful for those of us in the culture space looking for meaning. I think we've found it here. So thank you very much. It was thoughtful, it was balanced, it was incredibly deep, wonderful and thorough. So thank you for that, taking your time to present that to the SIETAR community, to the cultural community. And we're going to make a recording of this available. Everyone who's stayed on and asked their questions and done their stuff, thank you very much. It's your interaction that makes the whole thing live. And more than a lecture. I thought it wasn't a lecture, it was a philosophical journey. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you again soon, and this will be available, and let's keep the dialogue going. But just to finish, Livingstone, thank you so much for what you've done this evening.
Thank you, and thanks to those who participated. All the best. Thank you.
All right, guys. Well.